Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Tuesday, April 29th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid and political correspondent Sam Sokol. Hi there to you both. How are you?
Hi, Jessica.
Hey, Jessica. Hey, Sam.
Hi there. It is day 571 of the war. A series of freed hostages made statements on Monday afternoon and Monday evening about the nature of captivity. Freed hostage Keith Siegel spoke about the quote medieval torture end quote of captivity in Gaza. Omer Shem Tov asked U.S. President Donald Trump to apply pressure and save the captives once again. And that was all against the background of Israeli government officials saying that Israel will not accept the 5-year truce that is being offered. We will talk with Jacob about what actually seems to be happening with the hostage talks, as well as expectations for Israel regarding Syria, and comments about Israel and Saudi Arabia, according to an aide for former U.S. President Joe Biden. We'll also take a deeper look at the latest with the Haredi draft, as Sam covered today, Haredi extremists harassing ultra-Orthodox recruits, and the draft of a law regulating ultra-Orthodox recruitment, and what are the numbers right now. So stay with us for all of that.
A child,
A soldier,
A farmer.
a grandparent.
In our Those We Have Lost project, the Times of Israel tells the stories of individuals slain in Hamas's brutal attack on October 7th, 2023, with 1,100 individual entries covering almost every single person killed by Hamas. Our Those We Have Lost project paints a picture of each of their lives and the ongoing ripple effects of their deaths. The Those We Have Lost project works to ensure that despite the massive scale of the loss, no one is forgotten.
a teacher,
A tourist.
a peacenik,
A farmer.
a grandparent.
a soldier.
Visit the project's homepage on the Times of Israel.
Together.
We keep their memories alive.
Okay, Jacob. So we have a number of headlines right now on the page about what is happening with negotiations between Israel and Hamas, obviously, the negotiations that are mediated by Egypt and Qatar, trying to figure out what we can discern here. As I just mentioned, there's an Israeli official stating that Qatar is not helping in the hostage talks, while there's also an Arab official reporting that reports are being manufactured by Israeli officials looking to harm negotiations. And of course, as I mentioned, then there are, many freed hostages saying, just need to get them out. It doesn't really matter how, just make it happen. Tell us what you're hearing.
Sure. So over the weekend, we saw a bit of a flood of reports in Hebrew media that either were unsourced or cited unnamed Israeli officials who were claiming that Qatar has been trying to secretly sabotage the talks by urging Hamas not to accept a recent Egyptian proposal for a hostage deal and ceasefire, basically saying, hold out, wait for us, and we'll get you a better deal that's worse for Israel, theoretically. Now, I spoke with an Egyptian official, so not a Qatari official, because obviously Qatar denied these allegations. But even an Egyptian official I spoke with said this is just completely untrue. The idea, also just thinking about it practically, that Qatar would want to risk its ties with the U.S., which are incredibly important to it at this moment, as it's facing a lot of criticism and needs to maintain a good relationship with the Trump administration. The idea that it would risk its standing by sabotaging the talks that the Trump administration is a part of is really not very logical, as this Egyptian official put it. And he said that the really right now we're working with Qatar. Obviously, we have some disagreements between our two countries, but overall, we're in lockstep about efforts to try to end the war. And that's what we're trying to do in these negotiations. And what this Egyptian official told me is that really what's happening right now is Netanyahu is trying to deflect blame from Israel and from being pointed at in his direction for the ongoing impasse in talks. And they say that this impasse is really caused by him and his consistent demands to not allow for an end to the war, even in an eventual scenario, that the Hamas is now demanding these guarantees to ensure that Israel this time around agrees to hold talks on the phase 2 final ceasefire of the agreement, something that Israel said it would do in the January framework, but never ended up getting around to do and pulled out of those negotiations and then tried to rework the terms of the deal. So Hamas is looking for something more concrete to ensure that doesn't happen again. And the mediators are having a hard time offering that, but still trying to get to a point where, yes, the idea is to get to an end to the war. I think it's kind of interesting to see where we're at this stage, because there was this cabinet meeting in Israel a few days ago where a lot of the ministers lashed out at Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff, who basically said, look, we have been holding off aid for almost, we're nearing 2 months right now. This idea that it was going to happen very quickly, that Hamas would just collapse, is not very realistic. It's going to take a lot more time and a lot more troops that we're not really seen to necessarily have, which I'm sure is something that Sam could talk a little bit about due to the problems with enlistment. But basically, this comes after there was this perception that a lot of Netanyahu and his circle made, was that once Trump comes into office and we had this new IDF chief of staff who's only concerned about just victory, we would be able to move forward and end the war with Hamas and be able to defeat their military and to dismantle their military and governing capabilities. But we're seeing that despite that, all those promises, that actually that's not the case. And now the argument is actually, well, the IDF has not been going all out in Gaza, and that we now really need to go even harder, is what Smotrich is demanding, and saying that he'll even leave the government if he doesn't see a change in the IDF's posture. So I think it's a bit of a reality check that the ministers are dealing with right now. I think there was this hope that things would just be immediate, and as a result, I think you're seeing increasingly parts of the Israeli security establishment saying, let's try to, we've made massive military gains in this war. Let's try to cut while we're ahead, get all the hostages out in a deal that does end the war, because we do believe that Hamas eventually will break the ceasefire and then we'll be able to go back and into Gaza and take care of them if need be. And that's where you see the public really is. And that's why multiple polls continue to show that actually the public wants a deal to end the war right now, to get all the hostages out, even if it removes the ability for Israel to say it won the war in the way that the total victory that Netanyahu had been trying to claim was possible.
Jacob, moving to Syria. We've got this piece about that this Republican lawmaker, Representative Marlin Stutzman, says in a Friday interview that we published that you wrote that Israel should be very careful not to divide Syria, which is really in these first initial months of, in a sense, figuring out who they are, recovering after the collapse of the Assad regime. Were you surprised to hear him have such an opinion about this? What were your thoughts as you were talking to him?
Not entirely surprised, because we have been seeing a drip of Republican lawmakers on the Hill who have been uncomfortable with the Israeli strategy in Syria. I think there's a lot of hope in the Republican establishment and also among Democrats that there's a real opportunity right now with this new regime led by interim president Ahmed al-Sharaa. He's obviously got a very controversial past given his involvement in al-Qaeda. But they see him as someone who has changed, that he's saying the right things about wanting to reunite Syria and make it a more democratic republic. and they want to give them the opportunity to at least try to succeed. Israel has a different approach to this all, and if you remember, right after the fall of Bashar Assad in December, Israel moved in right away into what it called a buffer zone in the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, and it's remained there and had a pretty massive presence there. In addition, it's been carrying out massive amounts of military strikes against various military positions that used to belong to the previous Syrian regime. They're trying to make sure that the chemical weapons that Assad might have still had don't get into the wrong hands, and also just robbing any potential for Shara's new government to really have a functioning military, wants to make sure that Turkey doesn't really gain too much of a foothold there, given that Turkey is the main backer to Shara. So they've tried to push this approach that's, instead of backing the new government, really trying to kneecap it from the get-go, and instead push this idea of having these sovereign, decentralized, or autonomous ethnic regions. So you have one, for example, in the north for the Kurds, and then one more in the south for the Druze, and maybe one for the Alawites, and another different ethnic groups. And this idea is to kind of keep Syria decentralized in a way that Israel believes, or at least the parts of the government right now. I think there's a dispute in the security establishment, but at least in the government feels that it's better to have a weakened Syria that will pose a less of a threat to Israel in the long run. But what Marlin Stutzman and Corey Mills, who were two Republican lawmakers who made this trip to Syria a couple weeks ago. They are the first Republicans, or first U.S. lawmakers to visit under this new regime. What they argue, or at least what they say Shara said, and it seemed to be that they were sympathetic with this idea, is that a weakened Syria is not a recipe for stability in the region, that we'll see something like what we had in Iraq, where it's continued to be something that Iran has been able to take advantage of, and not something that's in the U.S. interest, and they think also not in Israel's interest. And they said also this is really the main thing that Shara raised when he was asked about the potential for normalizing ties with Israel, which seems like a pretty wild idea to think about right now, a normalization between Israel and Syria. But he didn't rule it out, and he said if certain conditions are met, including the top of the list, moving aside this idea that you're trying to divide Syria, there's also, I think he mentioned, the desire to get Israel out of the buffer zone, but it didn't seem to be a deal breaker, for at least that's how Stutzman put it. And then maybe a stop on these military attacks that Israel's been carrying on a pretty regular basis. Notably, though, he didn't mention the Palestinian issue, according to Stutzman. So that's, I guess, gives Israel a window.
Yeah, what does that actually mean? Right, yeah.
I think the fact that it's the main condition for so many other countries, Saudi Arabia, in order to normalize, they said there's got to be progress there, a pathway to a Palestinian state. I think maybe Shara might bring that up if he was asked, or if the actual negotiations were held, it would come up. But in this meeting with these Republican lawmakers, it didn't. So the main question right now is whether or not the U.S. will remove some of these sanctions that it's been holding on Syria that have really crippled the economy. They were from the previous regime under Bashar Assad, but right now that you have donors that are donor countries in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others who are willing to come in and help revive the Syrian economy, which right now you can't even use like credit cards. Everything has to be done with cash. So it's very difficult to
very complicated
to maintain a stable economy in the country as a result of these U.S. sanctions. And I think the goal of the visit for Shara is to try to convince these U.S. lawmakers to maybe convince the Trump administration that this is a step worth taking. I think the Trump administration is still walking very diligently on this issue. I think a combination of not necessarily trusting Shara, but B, I think their just focus is so much elsewhere. So there's going to be, I think, a real effort, a campaign by Republican lawmakers, maybe led by Stutzman and Corey Mills, who were just there, to make this argument on behalf of Shara. But we'll see. I think it's going to take quite a bit of time. But it's interesting to see how Israel's involved in this whole process.
Okay, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, which brings us to our last topic for you today. So we have former aides to former U.S. President Biden. Of course, we're now a few months after he left office, so we're going to start to hear, I imagine, different comments about different issues. So one of his aides said in an interview on Sunday that Netanyahu's government missed an opportunity to reach normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia last year, which I was a little surprised about because last year we were embroiled already in this war and hostage situation. right?
That's where I think you might need to take some of these comments in this really fascinating series of interviews that the Channel 13 Hamakor investigative program did with 9 former top Biden officials. But several of them, this was Amos Hochstein, Biden's envoy for Lebanon, but he was also involved in other Israel-related issues, and he just said that this was a massive missed opportunity that really could have taken place. I think what first needed to happen, though, was a ceasefire and hostage deal that ended the war, and we're still
Look where
quite a
we
bit
are.
away from
Yeah.
that. But the other thing was this issue about granting a pathway to a future Palestinian state. Israel's argued that this is just represents a reward for terror, and therefore is very much against it. Was against it before October 7th to begin with, but now that's the main argument that they're using. While as these different Biden officials said that you don't have to frame this as a concession, because what we're trying to do is have a reformed Palestinian Authority, which is a more moderate foil to Hamas, enter the fray and allow Palestinians to have self-determination, but in a way that sidelines Hamas, so that they're no longer a threat to Israel. And this is actually the more effective way to do it, by having a viable alternative. It's just not something that is viewed as welcomed in Jerusalem. I think even moving towards the center of the political spectrum, for sure not on the right. But it was interesting to see how passionate some of these more hawkish pro-Israel officials in the Biden administration, like Amos Hochstein, like Jack Lew, the former ambassador to Israel, Dan
Right.
Shapiro, who even came out during this interview and said he was against the decision by Biden to withhold that shipment of 2,000-pound bombs. All three of these officials just felt that this is like so clearly in Israel's interest to take steps in this direction, and really baffled by the decision not to want to do so, frustrated by the lack of political space in Israel in order to take the steps that were necessary to get a Saudi deal. And Amos Hochstein was just like, we think you might have missed this opportunity now. It was still available during the war, even though I doubt that that's really true. But you can, hopefully it won't be missed in the future. So that was one topic that was quite interesting in this very full documentary episode.
There's a lot more there in that article. I just want to note to readers. So look for the link in the article attached to the podcast. Thank you, Jacob.
Thanks for allowing me to blab.
No. We're going to take a quick break. When we're back, Sam will talk to us about what is happening with the latest on the Haredi enlistment issue. So stay with us.
Israel Bonds, the heartbeat of solidarity, the powerhouse of support. When the Israeli-Hamas war hit, Israel Bonds stood tall, proving we're more than just an investment, we're a lifeline. Israel Bonds pledges to ensure Israel thrives and flourishes. Investing in Israel Bonds isn't just a financial move, it's a declaration for resilience, strength, and a better future for Israel. Join us and let solidarity echo through generations.
Okay, Sam, let's start with today. You started your day covering very significant demonstrations of Haredi protesters outside. Well, this happened at 2 different recruitment centers for the IDF. You were at one in Jerusalem. And ultra-Orthodox protesters harassing conscripts who were coming to literally start their enlistment in the new ultra-Orthodox brigade. So the Hasmonean Brigade, I noticed that it's called. Tell us what you saw, what was happening there today.
Well, as Jacob said, the IDF is struggling with a manpower shortage. The IDF's manpower director has told the Knesset that the army is short 12,000 soldiers, 7,000 of whom need to be combat soldiers. And many in Israel see the solution as finally recruiting the ultra-Orthodox. Currently, there are around 70,000 adult male members of the ultra-Orthodox community who are of military age and are not serving. And traditionally, the ultra-Orthodox have enjoyed widespread exemptions from military service, something that was struck down by the High Court of Justice in a groundbreaking ruling last summer. And so the army has made efforts to enlist the ultra-Orthodox, something which has been wall-to-wall opposed by the ultra-Orthodox rabbinic leadership. And this enlistment today of dozens of new ultra-Orthodox troops for this Hasmonean Brigade, a service track which is specifically tailored for the ultra-Orthodox lifestyle, was something that really inflamed passions among the radical extreme fringe of the Israeli ultra-Orthodox community. Now, this feeling of being against enlistment is mainstream, but the use of this type of violence to prevent enlistment is very much something on the extremes. And what happened is hundreds of protesters came out, both at the enlistment center in Jerusalem, the Lishkat HaGiyus, and at the Central Israeli Tel HaShomer base, where there is a section called the Bakum. Essentially, it's where the recruits, after they go through the process at the induction center, go to be processed, to be given their uniforms, to actually to take the first step to becoming soldiers.
Become soldiers, right.
And at the Bakum, or outside the Bakum, these ultra-Orthodox protesters tried to physically prevent the new troops from entering the base. And this was something that elicited widespread condemnation. Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said that the protesters should be arrested and prosecuted, and Oded Forer, a lawmaker with the opposition Yisrael Beitenu party, which has been very outspoken on the enlistment issue, reached out to the Attorney General in a letter demanding that they be prosecuted, not just for any violence that they engage in during the protests, but specifically because Israeli law stipulates that somebody who engages in hasata l'ishtamtut, in incitement to evasion, basically someone who goes and incites someone else to not obey a call-up order. During wartime, such a person has a mandatory, if found guilty, has a mandatory 15-year prison sentence. It's a very serious
Infringement.
infringement, but it's not something that seems to be enforced. In fact, as we've reported previously and discussed on the podcast, there's an entire ecosystem of ultra-Orthodox hotlines, one even linked to a cabinet minister, which provide advice to people who've received enlistment call-ups, and which pretty much across the board tell them to ignore orders. And this is something that the Attorney General and the police have not dealt with, and now we have renewed calls for them to do so. Time will tell if it happens. During today's protest outside the Lishkat HaGiyus Enlistment Center in Jerusalem, I saw protesters repeatedly try to get past a line of police, blocking them from approaching the IDF installation. The police responded by shoving, pulling, and dragging protesters. I saw several with ripped jackets. I saw one older ultra-Orthodox man on the floor with a black eye. And the protesters, in the meantime, were screaming slogans against the state of Israel, against the IDF, saying we would rather die than enlist, and we would rather die than enlist. And in the case of one policeman who was religious, they yelled at him that he was a chardak. That's a derogatory term for a religious person who joins the military.
Mm-hmm. Sam, this is against the background of, I was looking at two other pieces that you wrote recently. You had Lieutenant Colonel Avigdor Dickstein, head of the Haredi branch of the IDF's Personnel Directorate, telling the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee that despite attempts to recruit 4,800 Haredi men during the 2024-2025 draft cycle, only 1,721 have enlisted thus far. So you have that piece of information. And then you have a piece about Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee Chairman Likud MK Yuli Edelstein asserting that the panel he is heading is finally nearing a final draft of a law regulating ultra-Orthodox enlistment. So if you could sort of tie this all together in the last minutes of today's podcast, where does this leave us right now against the background of what we were all just talking about, which is that the IDF is talking about a larger push in Gaza and calling up reserve units, right? So there is this need for soldiers of all kinds. Yeah. Where do you see this all right now? What does this tell us?
Well, look, there's so much opposition in the ultra-Orthodox community to enlistment that this enlistment push, including the creation of new service tracks, which are specifically tailored for the ultra-Orthodox
Right.
community. I personally am not ultra-Orthodox. I served in one of these tracks 20 years ago in the Netzach Yehuda battalion. They are very much suitable for a religious lifestyle and a Haredi lifestyle. But there's this fear in the ultra-Orthodox community of secularization in the military. And so pretty much nobody has gone in. The Army aimed to recruit 4,800 Haredi men during the 2024-2025 draft cycle. Only 1,721 have enlisted. Moreover, since last summer's court ruling mandating that the Haredim do enlist, almost 19,000, specifically 18,915 Haredi men have received conscription orders. Out of those, only 232 have joined the army, and 57 of them in combat roles. Remember, the IDF has said it needs 7,000 new combat troops. So
Right.
this is much less than we need. Now, what's happening in terms of the legislation, the ultra-Orthodox parties have been pushing Netanyahu very hard to pass a bill that is currently stuck in the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Their goal is to essentially have this bill reinstate their lost exemptions, to re-legislate that. That's not something, even if it would pass in that way, that would pass muster with the Supreme Court. What Yuli Edelstein, the Likud MK who chairs the committee dealing with this bill, has said is he won't allow any bill to pass his committee that doesn't address the principles of equality and provide for the manpower needs of the IDF. Now, after holding this up for a very long time, in recent months, he's been holding many meetings of his committee to discuss the background, to gather data. And he's recently said that within the next few weeks, he's going to wrap up that phase and begin rewriting, creating a new draft of the legislation. Now, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens because the government very much does not want the vision that Edelstein wants. Edelstein's vision is to really draft all of the Haredim. He signed a proclamation not long ago, basically saying that universal conscription is his goal, at least in terms of the Haredi community. And the government, specifically the defense minister, has said that he wants to slowly raise the number of Haredim going to the army year on year until in 7 years we have half of the Haredim eligible going in. And we leave it at that, basically leaving half the Haredi community out of the military. So I think we're heading for a very, very interesting legislative showdown.
All right. Thanks, Sam. We know that we'll hear more about it from you, that's for sure. So thanks for being on today's Daily Briefing. Jacob had to leave us already, but it's been good to have both of you here today.
Pleasure.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments you have, you can always write us, podcast@timesofisrael.com. And of course, recommend us to other listeners and rate us wherever you find your podcasts. Until next time, take care, be well, have yourselves a good day.